They will fool lots of people. You're going to hear about wars, actual wars and rumored ones. Make sure you don't get alarmed. This has got to happen, but it doesn't mean the end is coming yet. Nations will rise against one another, and kingdoms against each other. There will be famines and earthquakes here and there. All this is just the start of the birth pangs. Then they will hand you over to be tortured, and they will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will find the going too hard, and they will betray each other and hate each other. Many false prophets will arise, and they will deceive plenty of people. And because lawlessness will be on the increase, many will find their love growing cold. But the one who lasts out to the end will be delivered. And this gospel of the kingdom must be announced to the whole world as a witness to all the nations. Then the end will come.
Thank you, Sherry Ann. Wonderful. Well, we're in week 3 of this series called Do Not Be Afraid. And it's an alternate way to look at this passage that Sherry Ann just read and others in the Bible that much of the church considers in our future, that it might be a prophecy of things that we are to look forward to. I'm teaching a different way to look at it. You're welcome to hold that view if you'd like, but we also are following N.T. Wright and other New Testament scholars asking this question: what would that passage have meant to the disciples in the first century when Jesus first talked to them about that? How could they have understood it in the way that we sometimes do today? And so we are, as I say, we're in week 3, and so our approach to this, our interpretive approach, is that how would the original audience, how would those 12 disciples who Jesus was speaking to in Matthew 24 have heard and understood this passage that we call the Olivet Discourse? Jesus and his disciples were on the Mount of Olives, so it's been called the Olivet Discourse. We'll try to conceive of the way his disciples would have heard Jesus, and when they ask questions, we'll try to conceive of what were the questions they were asking. Not what are the questions that we might ask today in 2,000 years in the future, but trying to understand first, what does this passage mean, or what did it mean to the original people that heard it? And we noticed last week that there are 2 verses where Jesus says essentially the same thing. Matthew 23:36, he said, "Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation." Then he has a string of prophetic declarations, part of which you heard Sherry Ann read this morning, and there are others. And then in Matthew 24:34, he says basically the same thing. "I tell you this generation will not pass until all these things have taken place." So Jesus seems to have bookended this long series of prophecies with these 2 statements that said this generation will not pass until all these things take place. Now, if you can put yourself on the Mount of Olives in about AD 30, and you heard Jesus say, "This generation," what would you have thought he was talking about? You would have thought he was talking about that generation, their generation that they were living in today, at that time. They certainly wouldn't have conceived that he was saying this generation as meaning some generation 2,000 years off in the future. They wouldn't have been able to conceive it that way. Although the church has interpreted it that way, some of the church, for some time. And we're going to try to go that route in this study. So in Matthew 24:1, we read this: as Jesus came out of the temple, and you remember last week and the week before we talked about Jesus had just left the temple where he had pronounced 7 or 8 woes on the scribes and Pharisees. Basically, he was very heartbroken over the fact that they had rejected him, that they hadn't seen him as the Messiah, they hadn't followed his direction like his disciples had, and he pronounces these woes, these words of judgment really on the scribes and Pharisees. And then as he's leaving, the disciples came to him and they point out to him the buildings of the temple. And he asked them, "You see all these what? All these buildings." Some translations say all these stones. "Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." So Jesus is speaking of the temple that existed then in the first century, which we call the Second Temple, Herod's temple. He's speaking of prophecy now, and we can see here that he's limiting this prophecy to that temple at that time. He's not speaking of maybe sometime in the future where a temple might be reconstructed or rebuilt. He's talking about this temple that was right there in front of them. So we're trying to pay attention to the context here. And we know historically that about 40 years later, the Roman commander Titus came into Jerusalem with 20,000 soldiers. They surrounded the city for 4 months. They didn't allow any food or water or anything in or out of the city, and basically starved the city for a period of time, about 4 months, until they were so weak it was very difficult for them to fight. And then they invaded the city. They destroyed the temple. They leveled the city and the temple, burned it and pillaged it, killed over 1 million Jews, and led nearly 100,000 away as prisoners. So we can see that there was actually a literal fulfillment of these prophecies, at least some of them. So what we've been doing in this series is working through these a verse at a time to help ourselves understand, could these prophecies that Jesus spoke then 2,000 years ago have been fulfilled in that actual generation that he was speaking to? So as they leave the temple, they go up on the Mount of Olives, and then his disciples come to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the age?" So we made note last week that they really asked 3 questions, not just one question. The first one was, when will this be? And we asked, what are they talking about? When will this be? Well, he had just told them the temple would be destroyed, that not one stone would be left on top of another. So their first question has a real here and now application. When will this temple be destroyed is when they're asking. And then they said, what will be the sign of your coming? And we asked, to a first century disciple of Jesus, could they have been asking, when will your second coming be? And we answered that no, they couldn't have been asking that, because they didn't even understand that he had to die. They were expecting him to kick the Romans out and to rebuild the nation of Israel there in Jerusalem at that time. So when they say, when will, or what will the sign of your coming be, in that context, they weren't asking, when will you go away, be gone for a period of time, and then come back in a second coming, because they didn't understand anything about his death. They didn't understand anything about his resurrection. They didn't understand anything about his ascension. All these things that we understand now, they could not have understood. They could not have even conceived, and we saw that through multiple examples. Even at the resurrection, when the women came and told them the tomb was empty, they said, that's nonsense. They didn't believe it. So they couldn't have conceived, when they're asking this question, about a second coming. They couldn't have been asking about a second coming. So they're asking about some other kind of coming in the first century. What could that have been? We understood it as coming into his kingdom as the king of Israel. That's what they were hoping for. They were hoping for the Messiah to come in and set up a throne, kick out the Romans, and bring Israel back to its glory days, like when David was king. And then they asked the third question, and of the end of the age. Not the end of the world, which many people today would assume that he's talking about. They're asking about the end of the world, the end of time when Jesus comes a second time. They couldn't have been asking that question. They had no concept of that. They couldn't have been even conceiving of that at this point. They're asking about when does the age of Torah and law end and the age of the Messiah begin. They understood the whole map of history in those 2 ages, the age of Moses and the law, and the age of the Messiah. That's what they're asking about. Now, that's not to say there might not be a second fulfillment of some of these prophecies, but we're again in this study trying to understand, what did they understand Jesus was talking about in the first century. Everybody good? Okay, so let's start part 3 with verse 8. We finished at verse 7 last week, and the tail end of verse 8 says, all this is but the beginning of birth pangs. What is he referring to? He's referring to the things he's just spoken about. Which, if we look at verse, he's talking about false Christs coming in verse 5. He's talking about wars and rumors of wars in verse 6. He's talking about nations rising against nation and kingdoms against kingdom and famines and earthquakes, which we visited all of those last week. So if you need to review those are all on our website, meetingplace.church. So we saw that all of those things actually happened in the first century. There were famines, there were earthquakes, there were false Christs. All of those took place in the 40 years after Jesus had been with us in the flesh. And he says all these things, the earthquakes, the famines, and so forth, are just the beginning of birth pangs. So Jesus is likening what's about to happen to the birth of something new. This is how I like to think of this passage. You can get really depressed reading some of these things. you can think this because there's lots of natural disasters. There's lots of death and destruction being talked about in here. But Jesus envisions it as the birth of something new. So there's a lot of pain when a baby is born, I hear. I haven't been through it personally myself, but it's interesting to me that Jesus uses the language of birth in this passage because, yes, there is a lot of pain in childbirth, in birthing something new, in birthing a new baby, in birthing a new age, which is what Jesus is talking about here. He's saying there's something new going to be birthed, and it's going to be painful getting it birthed. But women never, that I know of, spend the rest of their 18 years when they're raising their birthed kids stressing over how painful their birth was. They seem to forget about that, and they get on to raising the kid. They get on to the joy of having that new life among them. So I think we ought to keep that in mind as we're going through this too. The fact that Jesus likened what he's talking about to a birth of something new is optimistic to me. It's good news. That, yeah, there is something old passing away, but something new and good is coming out of it. It's a relationship of God based on mercy, not sacrifice, is what he's really talking about. Because the temple, remember, we keep in mind that the temple was the place where sacrificial religion was practiced. It's where the Jews brought their animals and sacrificed them to God to get their sins covered. It was that whole concept that God needed to have sacrifice in order to forgive our sins. But Jesus repeatedly would say, I don't desire sacrifice, I desire mercy. Or he'd say to the Pharisees, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He didn't say I want mercy with sacrifice. No, he wants mercy to supersede sacrifice. So beginning at verse 9, then they will hand you over to be tortured and will put you to death. And you will be hated by all nations because of my name. And many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. So Jesus is predicting here, in context, a time of persecution, especially for followers of him, disciples of Jesus. That they'll be handed over to be persecuted and killed, and that many people will fall away, and they'll betray one another and hate one another. So we have to ask ourselves again, did this happen? Was there persecution in the first century before the destruction of the temple? And did many people fall away? This is not, we're not going to read it like futurists and dispensationalists do today, where they expect this all in our future. I think it would be a great future if we didn't have to expect this, wouldn't you? If we weren't, that's not to say we won't have some of it, because following Jesus can sometimes lead to martyrdom, can sometimes lead to these sort of things. But in the context, again, we want to ask, was there persecution and falling away between the time Jesus said this and the destruction of the temple? And I'll say yes, and here's some examples. Right in our own Bible, we'll see some. In Acts 8, that day a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen. Why did they bury him? Because he was just stoned to death with Saul overseeing it. That sounds like persecution to me. And made loud lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church by entering house after house, dragging off both men and women. He committed them to prison. So there's one example of persecution early after the resurrection of Jesus. Another case after Saul's conversion, and he became Paul, with Paul and Barnabas at Antioch, in Acts 13, but the Jews incited the devout women of high standing and the leading men of the city and stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and drove them out of their region. Paul described his own persecutions in 2 Corinthians as his tribulations, saying he was whipped 5 times with 39 lashes each, beaten with rods 3 times, stoned once, 3 times shipwrecked, once left for dead. That sounds like persecution to me. Also, in addition to what the Bible tells us about first century persecutions, we know that Nero, who was the emperor of Rome from 54 to 68, did. From Philip Schaff's book, History of the Christian Church, we read this: a vast multitude of Christians, this is not a small amount, a vast multitude of Christians were put to death in the most shocking manner. Some were crucified, probably in mockery of the punishment of Christ. Some sewed up in the skins of wild beasts and exposed to the voracity of mad dogs in the arena. The satanic tragedy reached its climax at night in the imperial gardens on the slope of the Vatican, which embraced the present site of the place where the Church of St. Peter sits. Christian men and women covered with pitch or oil or resin and nailed to posts of pine were lighted and burned as torches for the amusement of the mob, while Nero, in fantastical dress, figured in a horse race and displayed his art as a charioteer. Burning alive was the ordinary punishment of incendiaries, but only the cruel ingenuity of this imperial monster under the inspiration of the devil could invent such a horrible system of illumination. So we know that, in fact, Nero persecuted the church, killed thousands of Christians, used them as his own human torches to light his garden at night. So there certainly was persecutions going on in the first century. Were there fallings away and betrayals? Well, we see verse 10 says that, then many will fall away and will betray one another. Well, Paul stated in 2 Timothy, you are aware of the fact that all who are in Asia turned away from me, among whom are Phygelus and Hermogenes. So Paul saw a turning away, a falling away in the people in his own ministry. Then historian Tacitus wrote, Nero had self-acknowledged Christians arrested. Then, on their information, large numbers of others were condemned. So there was the process where you arrest one person, maybe torture them until they give up other people. And this was Nero's practice, to arrest some Christians, torture them until they gave up the names of other Christians. That's the betrayal passage. Everybody okay with that? So we can answer yes to falling away and betrayals. Those did happen in large numbers in the first century. And then verse 11 says, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. I don't know how many times I've heard people warning today that we have to be careful of false prophets. And we do. We have to be careful of not being led astray. But did it happen in the first century is what we're asking today. Were there many false prophets between the Olivet Discourse and the destruction of the temple in AD 70? Well, in 2 Peter 2, we read this, but false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. So Peter witnesses to the fact that there were false prophets then in the first century. Paul warned the Ephesians in Acts 20, for I know this, that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Also from among yourselves men will rise up, speaking perverse things, to draw away the disciples after themselves. There's 2 examples. Here's another one in Acts 13. Now when they had gone through the island to Paphos, they found a certain sorcerer, a false prophet, a Jew whose name was Bar-Jesus. So we see 3, here's another one, here's 4. 1 John 4:1, beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits that they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. So we see 4 examples of false prophets recorded in Scripture. I didn't bother to bring in any other extra biblical texts for that, but those exist as well. How about lawlessness? In verse 12, and because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. I remember growing up and my parents quoting this verse. Whenever they saw an increase in crime, they would quote this verse and say, oh, this is a fulfillment of prophecy that lawlessness will increase. Well, we may have increasing lawlessness in our time, but it seems to be cyclical. It goes up and down, and we see our attempts at keeping law and order. Some of them work, some of them are not so effective. But we learn from those things. We learn, and so our justice system learns, and our police departments learn. So there will always be an increase and decrease of lawlessness, but our question is, in the context of these first century disciples, what would they have been expecting? What would they have heard when Jesus says, because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold? Paul wrote to the Thessalonians in 2 Thessalonians 2, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. So he uses that same word that Jesus used, the same Greek word, that there is lawlessness at work. Josephus, the historian we've quoted in this series a few times, speaks to this. He says, the zealots, those were the Jews of whom some were in Jesus' 12 disciples. Some of them were zealots. They were people that thought it was okay to use violence to bring in the kingdom of God, or bring in this transition from one age to another. So zealots were the most zealous of the disciples, in other words. They would, just like we would use the word today, and so this is who Josephus is speaking about here. The zealots act as though they had covenanted to annul the laws of nature along with those of their country. Every human ordinance was trampled underfoot. Sounds like lawlessness to me. Sometimes you can get so zealous that you just disregard civilized cultures that you live in and violate the laws because you feel like your cause gives you reason to violate the laws in a violent way. And that's what Josephus is speaking of. And then he goes on, in speaking of that generation, the first century, he says, I shall therefore speak my mind at once here briefly. You always know when a historian says that something big is coming after that. He goes on, neither did any other city, he's speaking of Jerusalem, neither did any other city suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world. So Josephus points out that the very city of Jerusalem in this first century, in his view, became the most wicked city in the world, in the history of the world. That sounds like lawlessness at work to me, does it not to you? Okay, verse 13. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. This is Jesus speaking now. So I always read this and thought, well, in futurist eschatology, it speaks of a rapture and a period of tribulation, and if you're not saved and you end up not being raptured and you end up being here during the tribulation period, if you will endure to the end of that tribulation period, which will not be an easy job, then you'll be saved. That's how I always was taught about this verse. But I want to ask, what would the first century disciples have heard when Jesus said, but the one who endures to the end will be saved? So the immediate question is, the end of what? The end of the world, like I'd been taught to think? Or how would they have understood Jesus? The end of what? The end, well, he's answering the first question still. He's answering the question, when will this happen? When will the temple be destroyed? When will this come about? And in that context, he's saying the one who endures to that end, to the time when the temple is destroyed, that person will be saved. Actually, what was going to end was the Old Testament sacrificial practice of religion. Because when the temple was destroyed, the sacrificial practice of Jewish religion died with it. And it's never been reinstituted in the 2,000 years since. There was a transition that happened in Judaism from sacrificial Judaism to rabbinical Judaism. So the rabbis teach, just like we sit here and we teach, but they don't have a temple. And they don't offer sacrifices outside the temple, because the Jewish religion needs a temple to offer sacrifice. So it's interesting that when what was the end, that I believe the end that Jesus was talking about was the end of that system. Why? Because there was no sacrifice any longer needed. I'm actually of the opinion that God never wanted sacrifice. Hosea and Amos and many of the other prophets say, I don't want your sacrifices, I want your hearts. God is always after our hearts. He's never after our acts of sacrifice. In the New Testament, it calls our works, our efforts at praise is sacrifice. But let me read you what Henry Alford, a New Testament scholar, has written about this verse. He says, the primary meaning of this verse seems to be that whoever remained faithful till the destruction of Jerusalem should be preserved from it. Whoever remained faithful to Jesus until AD 70, when the temple and the city was destroyed, would be preserved from it. Now, and he goes on to say, no Christian that we know of perished in the siege. Historians know of no Christian who died in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. A million Jews died in it. And we'll see later in this chapter why that was the case. Because Jesus warns in this chapter that when you see certain signs, you should get out of the city of Jerusalem and you should leave. And they did. And they moved, they left, and most of them went to a city called Pella that we know of, that they saw these signs leading up to this destruction, and they got out of there. And historians tell us that there's no record of any Christian being killed in that destruction of Jerusalem. Luke, in his telling of the Olivet Discourse, also adds this, but not a hair of your head will be lost. I like that one. I like that. Not a hair of your head will be lost. So when Luke records Jesus saying, not a hair of your head will be lost, who would those first century disciples assume Jesus was speaking about when he said, not a hair of your head will be lost? He was speaking about them. He was speaking about, they wouldn't have assumed that he's speaking of their far off distant descendants' heads, would they? They would have thought that he was speaking of their heads. And actually, most of them were alive. Many of them, well, actually, these disciples, most of these guys, actually were killed in the persecution leading up to that. But their disciples, the ones that they introduced to Christianity, many of them were alive. Everybody with me? All right, one more verse. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. All right, this is the game changer for a lot of people. Because people will sit here and read this verse and say, well, the good news of the kingdom hasn't been proclaimed throughout the world yet. There are still people alive in the world today that haven't heard the gospel. So Jesus must be speaking about some far off distant generation, not the generation that he was speaking to. Do you see where you would feel that way? This is why I felt that way for a long time. But he says twice, this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Well, first, let's define the word world here in this passage. This good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world. That word world is a Greek word, oikumene, and it can mean one of three things, or any of these three things. It can mean the inhabited earth, not the whole earth in itself, but the parts of the earth that are inhabited. It can also mean the portion of the earth that's inhabited by Greeks and Jews, not barbarians. Because in the first century, when people spoke of the world, they really meant the educated world, the Greek and Roman worlds, not the barbarian parts of the world. It could also mean the Roman Empire. And through historical books, we can see that when that word oikumene is used in history from that period, it often didn't refer to the whole globe. Remember, they didn't even understand that the world was round at this point. They didn't have a concept for the whole world. So when they say world, they mean what they knew of, what they were aware of as existing. So You remember when Jonah took off in the Old Testament and he went to the ends of the earth, it says. Where did he go? Well, he went to a place near Turkey, which at the time then was as far as they knew. That was as far as they had explored of the world, and it was called the ends of the earth. But we know now we live well beyond the ends of the earth, right? Over here in the United States. So, this word world we have to be careful with. We read it today, and we have the concept of the world as this big globe, and we know what it looks like. We know where all the continents are. We know where all the inhabitants live. So if we apply our definition of world back into this text, we could be misled. Right? Now, we can know that this took place. We can know that this verse 14, took place in the disciples' generation for two reasons. First, we know it took place because Jesus said it would. If you won't quibble with him over which generation he's talking about. We can also know it took place because Paul said it had happened. Let me show you how. In Colossians, we read this. Because of the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel, that's the gospel, the good news of the gospel, which has come to you, as it has also in all the world, and is bringing forth fruit, as it is also among you since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. So Paul there says this gospel was coming into all the world. In Colossians 1:23, he says this, if indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Again, Paul is using pretty large language, pretty all-inclusive language to say the gospel had been preached. So what is he saying? He's saying this gospel has been preached to all the inhabited earth, or all the civilized earth. He's not saying it's been preached to South America, because they didn't know anything about South America. He's not saying it's been preached in North America or in Antarctica. He's not saying that because they had no concept of those places, right? And then in Romans, we read this. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. So when we use the Bible to interpret the Bible, that's a good thing to do. When we see how the Bible uses particular words, and then we pay attention to that, we can see that verse 14 actually we can see as being fulfilled, that the gospel had been preached throughout the whole world as they understood it in their time. Also, is there Old Testament precedent for this kind of language? Well, for instance, David writes in Psalm 118, all the nations surrounded me. Now, no, actually all the nations of the world weren't surrounding David in Psalm 118, but he felt like they were. It felt like all the nations of the world were coming against him. Also in Genesis 41:57 says, the people from all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. What does that mean? Did Indians from South America, Mayans, make their way across to buy grain from Joseph? No. No, even though they existed at the time, that's not what these authors were talking about. They were talking about all the people from the inhabited earth that they were aware of came at that time. So we need to pay attention to how the Bible uses words like world and apply that usage to these passages. All right, does that make sense? Sorry, I'm kind of machine gunning you with a lot of stuff today because I don't want to take too long to get through Matthew 24. We still have to get through Thessalonians and Revelation. So we'll move on to our discussion part of the service today. So those of you that are visiting, first, welcome. We're so happy that you're here with us today. Nice to have you. There's a couple of things in the pew racks in front of you. There's a contact card. If you'd like to get on our email mailing list, just fill that out and drop it in the basket on the way out if you'd like. There's also a meeting place discussion guideline card there. So we're a little bit different. Because we're small, we can take time after each message for questions and for discussion. But we have some guidelines of how to do that so that we're respectful with one another, so that we know how to express our opinions in a way that doesn't diminish anybody else's opinions and so forth. So just glance at that, if you would, as we begin the discussion time, and we usually take maybe 20 minutes or so, and ask questions if anybody has any. So there we are. Any thoughts for the message today?